The space race, a global phenomenon that saw the world caught in a race to the moon between the two leading superpowers of the world, the USA and the Soviet Union. The space race, in itself, a small episode in the wider ranging Cold War, which contained events prior to the space race such as the Korean War in the 50s, the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. All of these events had the US and Soviet Union battling to see who was the greatest on the world stage, and one of those standoffs culminated into a struggle to see who would win the race to space. The space race kicks off with the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. This was the first of many victories for the Soviet Union in the early days of the space race. At this point, American officials began to worry. It seemed to them and the American public that the communist technology was becoming more advanced than the American. This led then President Dwight Eisenhower to pour additional funds into the space program. While the Americans' fears were growing, so were the achievements of the Soviets. The second success of the space race saw once again the commies coming out on top with the launch of Sputnik 2 less than a month after the first Sputnik. Sputnik 2, however, was carrying a living being, a dog named Laika. Unfortunately, Laika died after 9 days in orbit. Laika had proved, however, it was possible, with the right provisions, that someone could indeed live out in space. After the two Russian victories, the Americans came back with a punch of their own. In 1958, a U.S. Army-designed satellite named Explorer 1 was launched. It was America's first step in the space race. The same year saw the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA. U.S. involvement in the space race wasn't only used to flex American technological might. It also gave way to advanced intelligence gathering from U.S. satellites. The CIA led the charge on this operation, and it went under the codename Corona. The commies continued to separate themselves from the U.S. by launching the Luna 1, which saw for the first time a satellite leave the Earth's orbit. Luna 2 then followed in 1959. The Luna 2 became the first probe to reach the moon. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets were able to send a man out into space. Yuri Gagarin holds the honor of being the first man in space, an achievement that was quickly followed by an American response. On May 5, 1961, astronaut Alan Shepard was launched into space. Although he did not orbit, it was the start of an American presence in space. This was quickly followed by a speech made by JFK, and in it he made the bold claim that America would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
This sparked an American drive that boosted American technology ahead of the Soviets. In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Later that year, NASA started to lay the foundations of a new lunar landing program named Project Apollo. Kennedy's speech saw NASA's budget soar to an increase of 500%, which allowed the lunar landing program to go from 34,000 NASA employees to 375,000 industrial and university contractors. Unfortunately for the Americans, they experienced a major setback on January 27, 1967, when 3 astronauts were killed on the Apollo 1 launch simulation. Roger Chaffee, Virgil Grissom, and Ed White II lost their lives to a cockpit fire. The Russians, meanwhile, were experiencing setbacks of their own. The Russian government was debating over whether the space program was necessary. Along with the untimely death of the chief engineer of the Soviet space program, Sergei Korolev, in 1966, saw the Soviets starting to fall behind in the race to the moon. December 1968 saw the Apollo 8 successfully carry a man into the moon's orbit. And on July 16, 1969, three astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, launched off the pad at Cape Canaveral, Florida in the Apollo 11. Their target? To land on the moon. 4 days later, on July 20th, 1969, roughly 600 million people turned on their TVs to watch one of the biggest events in human history.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
By landing on the moon, the US ended the space race and simultaneously won it as well. A decade-long dispute to show the world who was the better superpower. Although the Russians had an early lead, the Americans soon ran away with the competition and ended it all together on July 20th, 1969. The commies never made it to the moon. After several failed attempts between 1969 and 1972, including a launch pad explosion in 1969, saw the Soviets' desire to go to the moon diminish.